This presentation is about psychedelics and power structures. So what potential might psychedelics hold for affecting systemic change? So looking beyond their therapeutic potential on individuals and actually looking at these therapeutic mechanisms and seeing how we can extrapolate beyond the individual and affect a structural change, because we should want this paradigm shift to liberate us collectively, not just individually. And so collectively means taking into account of structure, because we don't just live together as individuals, we live in a world that is structured in a certain way. And this structure is capitalism, and quite specifically neoliberalism, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Going to look at how this structure makes us feel, so the unconscious ways that it makes us feel, and this is broadly called affect, and going to be outlining how the system we're in induces this certain effect in us, which in turn sustains the system. So there's a vicious cycle going on between the structure we live in and how we feel on a daily and implicit basis. And then I'm going to show how psychedelics can get in and have the potential to break up this vicious cycle. Yeah, okay. I think this is important because it highlights how our individual mind bodies are affected by and affect our social structures in unconscious ways, which is an important avenue for psychedelic research, especially as psychedelics are immediately well placed as unmaskers of the unconscious and also as manipulators of the self-other boundary. So I think it's important that we also look at how we can harness this to actually manipulate the pervasive and insidious relationships and mechanisms that exist between individuals and social structures. A lot of the research looks at how this goes on internally, but there's also things going on the structural level. Okay, so I'll start by outlining affective capitalism. So this is the body, it's a small body of literature that looks specifically at how capitalism makes us feel in these unconscious, implicit ways. So affect is what describes this unconscious feeling which is embodied. So the opposite of rational intellect, but rather embodied unconscious feeling. And affective capitalism is the theory of how our socio-economic structure influences our daily lives just by living in this structure, fosters certain affects that promote its own agenda, which is maximization of profit. So this is the goal of the structure that we live in. Its ultimate goal is just maximizing profit at all costs. This is largely done through the absence of regulations and the existence of free markets, so the idea that supply and demand just dictates profit. And because the goal is maximizing profit, this is necessarily a hierarchical structure, because it's not possible to have that goal and not be making profit while someone else is having a shortcoming. So we immediately have this quite triangular structure happening. And this specific structure instills certain emotions in us. And this is everything that is symbiotic with the ultimate goal of maximizing profit. It's not like there's someone's specific mind causing this. It's just the structure as a whole. So this is just the thoughts and feelings that come with this structure and feed back into it. Okay, so I'll give an example. For example, if you're feeling really stressed at work because you don't get enough hours, so there's been a huge increase in 0 hours contracts. If you don't get enough hours, you might know that getting more hours is contingent on you working harder. So you're stressed because you need to work harder in order to actually guarantee these more hours, which is what you need to live. So it's really important. It's the means to actually survive is not secure. It's very insecure, and it's reliant on meeting certain conditions. And that is the crux of this, that the means for survival, they're there, but they're withheld. They're withheld at the top of this structure, and they're given if you meet certain conditions, and that is what causes this affect of anxiety. So I'm arguing that the predominant affect of living in this structure is anxiety because of this access to survival. And these sort of conditions are things like really intense performance management, so like with the example I gave, but this also exists not just within a certain workplace, but also just generally in society. So just to even get a job, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and this is all put on the individual to do. So another example is academia. You know, a lot of us here are involved in academia, and that is an institution that is extremely structured in this way, because it's really hard to get a permanent job, to just have a secure income. To do that, you usually have to go through multiple temporary jobs and actually publish papers all the while you're doing that. You don't even get paid to publish papers. But the knowledge that your labour has gone into creating is sold for huge amounts of money by like these journals that gatekeep that knowledge. So that's another example. And why this causes this anxiety is because it's internalized. These conditions are internalized, which means that we police ourselves. That's why I've got the image of the Panopticon as the structure. It was a prison structure where there was just the idea of a prison guard watching people in the middle by that tower. There doesn't actually need to be a person there, because just by giving the idea of it, people police themselves. And so it's a matter of necessity that we have to police ourselves, because we need to do this to meet these conditions to get access to survival. And so I'll just briefly talk about the benefit system. So that's sometimes given an example of why what I'm saying might not be the case, because there's this whole system that actually can keep you safe if you can't meet these conditions. But in reality, the benefit system is actually structured in the very same way. You have to meet all these conditions to actually get this money that's supposed to be protecting you. So for example, someone who worked for the DWP on the phone lines, awarding people their sick benefits, they were a whistleblower, and they explained that they were trained to ask questions such as, can you tell me why you haven't killed yourself yet? So that's the reality of this structure. And lastly, so because of this internalization, we have a sense of self, which is highly filled with self-critique. And the way that this is related to others is with a relation of competition. So we see ourselves of this self-critique because we internalize these standards just by having to live in the structure. And then we apply that to other people through competition. And this competition is everywhere, from school to work to now social media. So the system has even assimilated the social areas of life into it as well. Yeah. Okay, so really importantly, what's going on is personalized. So this is largely through the narrative of individualism. It means that the effects and causes of anxiety are constrained to the sphere of the individual, to protect the system from critique. So if you're feeling anxious, usually this is talked about as just a cognitive defect or an imbalance in the brain. And I'm not saying that this isn't going on, but there's a lot more to it. That's not where the causation ends. But obviously the system wants us to think that because it protects itself from critique, because it keeps the frame of reference at the individual by what's going on is just in the individual's brain, and then the way that we deal with that is just by giving the individual drugs, which isn't, like, drugs is another huge part of this profit-making agenda. And then when the material effects of what's going on are seen, such as lack of jobs, this is also blamed on individuals, like, for example, immigrants. So the structure is like the elephant in the room. Okay, so what can we do about this? So often people might know this, but there doesn't seem to be enough to actually resist it, and that's because of this cycle of affect, that what's really important that's going on is this feeling that's induced, because even if you disagree with this rationally, you often still have to feel these feelings of anxiety just by engaging with this system as a matter of necessity. And that feeling is often what can actually stop us being able to act and change the situation. So I think that psychedelics can be a really helpful thing that can actually instill a new feeling and actually bring a new affect that can get right in there and disrupt this cycle that's going on and bridge the gap between knowing and action. Okay, so I'm going to outline 3 mechanisms that are present in the recent therapeutic literature: ego dissolution, a unitive experience, and connectedness. So ego dissolution is the experience of losing your ego. So some quotes that described it are: I experienced a dissolution of myself. I felt at one with the universe. I felt a sense of union with others. I experienced a decrease in my sense of self-importance. I felt far less absorbed by my own issues and concerns. All notion of self and identity dissolved away. Then we have the unitive experience, which is quite closely linked to ego dissolution. And that's the experience of just complete unity. So some quotes that described that were freedom from the limitations of yourself and feeling a unity or bond with what was felt to be greater than your personal self. Experience of the fusion of your personal self into a larger whole. Experience of oneness or unity with objects and or persons perceived in your surroundings. Experience of insight that all is one. And this has been linked to an experience of awe, and awe is described as an experience of something being so vast that you have to update your mental schemas beyond what you know. So there's this real experience of transcendence going on. And so ego dissolution and unitive experience make a lot of sense together, that in losing yourself, you would feel a unity with things beyond yourself. But then there's also this mechanism of connectedness, which seems to be coming up and is a really important therapeutic mechanism. This has been described as connectedness not just to the world and others, but also the self. So initially, there's like a bit of disparity. How can one lose themselves but also feel connected to themselves? And so I'm arguing that there's a certain type of self that is lost and actually a new identity of the self that is found. And that's where I think psychedelics can help the situation that I've described so far. So the new connection to the self is it's a qualitatively new experience, which is an experience of identifying the self as part of something larger. So it's an embodied and undeniable feeling that this is the case. So we have a new identity of actually being part of a bigger structure. And this goes straight up against the whole individualism agenda that is driving the vicious cycle between the structure and the anxious affect, because it actually causes a loss of all the things that the structure wants us to be thinking, which is this self-critique, thinking things like, you know, like, did I do that right? Oh, I should have worked harder. That person did it better than me. This kind of thing. If we actually experience ourselves as part of a wider collective, then questions like that become irrelevant. And so it seems like the experience of awe is quite an important thing that's going on here in inducing the small self, which is an experience of smallness of yourself in the face of something larger. But this smallness is not in like a demeaning way, it's in like a cathartic way. And importantly, you're not experiencing this larger thing away somewhere, you're part of it. And that seems to be really key. And so after experiences of awe, people have tended to emphasize the more collective elements of personal identity, and rather than saying I, they would talk more about themselves as an inhabitant of Earth or a member of the human race. And so this is going to have effects on our relatedness to others, which should be more compassion and more trust and more collaboration if we're actually experiencing ourselves as together and part of a larger entity. And so, as well as inducing this new affect, this feeling, it also challenges narrative, because in having this really transcendent feeling of being part of a larger structure, you're going to be more likely to see the structural elements around you, and which goes against the personalization narrative, because you're going to be more able to see how all this stuff is influenced by a wider structure, and hopefully be more inspired and actually feel like you can start to do things to change that. Because, yeah, and obviously psychedelics aren't going to just change the world like that, but I think they can inspire gradual actions. So for example, like a worker in getting these new feelings and having these new perspectives might be more inspired to unionize in the workplace. And, you know, if enough people actually feel that trust together, then maybe they could do quite a daring action that might actually change the structure they're in. But it's like things like that really rely on collectivity and people feeling part of something with each other. Or someone that might hold more power might be inspired to change the structure of their own workplace, for example, into a cooperative or something like that. If they actually start to feel like, you know, I'm just part of something with all these other people, maybe I shouldn't be holding this power in the top. Yeah, obviously one thing to think about with all of this as well is the kind of structures that are at play, or will be at play for the production and distribution of psychedelics themselves. So I would promote education and sharing skills so that people can actually have the power over this themselves, such as foraging and grow kits. Okay, so to wrap up, psychedelics are well placed to disrupt this vicious cycle that's going on that I've outlined. They're different to the standard mental health medication, which works very much in keeping the frame of reference to the individual and masking the structural powers that are at play. But I think psychedelics can be well placed to actually infiltrate this, because they can masquerade as just a sort of standard med that you take, because they are, you take it individually and it inspires feelings in the individual, but in doing this, it actually influences the way we think and feel in a way that goes beyond this framework and actually forces us to think collectively. And yeah, that's it. I hope that the psychedelic research can also be steered in this direction, to look at the structural elements of our mental health issues. They seem to be genuinely paradigm shifting in the mental health narratives already, by, focusing on trauma so much more than, and showing how important trauma is for how we feel, as opposed to, say, like chemicals or genetics. But I think we can even go beyond this and see how trauma often has structural roots, because it's part of this structure. We have a collective trauma through living in this way. Okay, thank you.